Alright, one of the first topics that I think is important to understand in looking at the Gilded Age is the growth of big business and the kind of boom-bust cycle of the U.S. economy. We'll focus mostly on the growth of the economy, but you can't forget that there were also recessions, what we would think of actually as depressions, during the Gilded Age. So here we go with our first one, the rise of big business. Alright, so in the Gilded Age, if you look at the period, the 35-year period, there is economic expansion, there is economic growth. So what caused that? Well, one of the first things is the results of the Civil War. During the Civil War, the government had pumped a ton of money into the economy, trying to win the war. The government appropriated funds to businesses. As long as you were producing products for the war, you were getting paid. Well, then at the end of the war, businesses have these massive cash reserves that they're able to turn around and convert into new factories, expansion, whatever. There's also, because the war ends, there's a feeling of political and economic stability, and so people both within the United States and without the United States are willing to invest their money here because they know that it will be relatively safe and provide them with some kind of economic benefit. Also during the Gilded Age, we can't forget this part, the fact that as people moved out west, here's one of our interconnections, they found valuable raw materials out there. And we're not necessarily just talking about gold. We're talking about other things, iron, nickel, precious metals that they would be able then to ship back to use in some of these growing industries. Also during the Gilded Age, government is going to take a pro-business attitude, and it really doesn't matter which political party you're looking at. As on paper, the Republicans would definitely be more pro-business than the Democrats, but this does not mean that the Democrats were not pro-business. They were as well. Government basically adopted a policy we call laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term. It means let it be, which basically translated in terms of what government was doing as government was to leave business alone and let business do what business was going to do. If you do that, if you don't interfere with business, businesses will grow, businesses will enhance the U.S. economy, and basically what's good for business is good for America. So as we look at the different businesses, we're going to look at just a few of them. We'll start with the railroads. And before we begin with the railroads, I want you to understand some of the things that we talk about. We talk about the specifics in the railroads, but the idea of the laissez-faire capitalism and some of the corruption we'll look at here applies to these other industries as well. But we will spend more time on the railroads because they were kind of the first big businesses. Railroads as an industry really started to grow between 1850 and 1874. Before 1850, they're small, they're local. There just wasn't a whole lot of investment capital. Here you see a map of the South, and this was a good place to start because the South kind of has the best example of where railroads weren't. If you look here, this was railroad track laid by 1859, and if you look over here, like in Texas, there's nothing virtually in Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana. There's just not a lot of railroads in this period. In 1873, there's something called the Panic of 1873. Whenever we see the word panic, we need to equate that in our modern definition of depression, economic collapse. Okay, millions of people unemployed, businesses going bankrupt. In fact, as a result of the Panic of 1873, 2/3 of all railroads went bankrupt. This does not mean that they ceased to function. What happens is when those companies go bankrupt, they cannot afford to pay their bills, their debts are more than not only the profits they're bringing in, but also the value of their business at times. And so what happens after the panic of 1873, from 1874 to 1900, railroads are going to explode. Here, by 1900, the railroads that have been created in the United States. So you see that mass of webbing going across the country. What happens is large railroad companies take over. Those that are able to, the one-third that are able to survive the panic. Some of them survived because they had a good economic foundation and they were well prepared for that. And what they started doing is buying up the smaller companies. If your company went bankrupt, you may have no choice but to sell out to somebody. Some of the large railroad owners, one of the first ones is this guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt. And I'm going to take just a second to talk about what he did. He started out as a steamboat operator. He had the largest steamboat operation on the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers in 1850. And in 1850, he decided to sell it all and use the money to invest in railroads. Well, if we look up here at the top, between 1850 and 1874, yes, railroads are growing, but they started out in 1850, they're all small. But they were being bought out, and they were being bought out by Vanderbilt. And he would use very different methods to do it. One of the methods he used was something called a hostile takeover. Okay? He would love to just walk into your business and say, look, I want to buy your railroad and give you cash, and that's it. A lot of people don't want to sell their business. It's their creation. They want to keep it. And so he would do this thing called a hostile takeover. If you offered stock on the stock market, he would start buying stock until he owned 51% of your stock. Buying stock makes you an owner. Once you own 51% of the company, those are not only shares of ownership, those are also shares of control. He would call a meeting of the stockholders. He would propose that the company sell out to Vanderbilt Railroads, and since he had 51% of the vote, the company would sell out. Okay? James J. Hill is another railroad operator. Hill and Jay Gould are going to be railroad operators, and they're actually going to get into a scheme to try to take advantage of what Vanderbilt would do with the hostile takeovers. They started doing something which is illegal now, called watering down the stock. You see, all companies, when they go on the stock market, they say, this is how much stock is in our company. Let's use a number like 1 million shares. Our company is worth 1 million shares. We're not going to put all of it on the stock market. We're only going to offer, say, 200,000. That's 20%, so the public can buy 20% of the company. We'll control 80%. Well, what would happen is these companies would put all their stock out there, and that's when Vanderbilt would say, okay, there's 1 million shares of stock out there. I'm going to buy 501,000. Get the majority in control. What Hill and Gould started doing was printing more stock certificates. They just artificially increased the amount of stock that was out there. Vanderbilt started buying and buying and buying and buying, and finally says, okay, do we have control of the railroad yet? No, not yet. Okay, buy more stock. And these guys just kept printing stock because they knew Vanderbilt would keep buying it and keep paying for it. And it's an illegal practice. Now, another big railroad owner is Leland Stanford. I mentioned his name now because we will talk about him at the very end, one of the things that he does. Okay. So anyway, so you have these guys that are putting together these huge railroad corporations. Now, the government also encourages railroads to expand. How do you encourage the railroad to build more tracks, say, into a place where there just isn't a business there yet? There's nothing to serve. What the government did is the government gave these railroads land grants. Okay, and so here we have our diagram of our little land grant here. Here's the railroad track. The government would when you built a railroad track, you would have 200 feet, somewhere between 200 and 400 feet of right-of-way. This is, for you, the railroad, to build access roads. You might put in additional tracks in here, things called switch tracks, where you have one train coming this way, one train coming that way, and you'll want to switch one off so they don't run into each other. In order to encourage these companies to build more track, the government started giving them these land grants, and they did it in this checkerboard pattern over here. Okay? This right here, beginning in 1862, the government said, look, we will give you 5 miles on either side of your right-of-way. And we'll section it off in these little checkerboard patterns here. So there's 10. Okay, so these are half-mile increments. Okay, 1/2 mile by 1/2 mile. This belongs to the railroad. This belongs to the government. And it went off in this checkerboard pattern. Now, what is a railroad going to do with all this? Honestly, not much. Okay? You do need to put some kind of refueling depot. You do need to put places where the train will stop, but you don't need all this. So what the railroads are doing with this stuff is they're selling it off to prospective settlers. So when people are moving west and they're looking to establish businesses, say, next to the railroad depot, they could buy that land from the railroads. They could offer this land to workers who are working on the railroad looking for land. They could offer it for very cheap if they wanted to try to attract workers. In 1864, the government is going to expand the amount of land available for the land grant. Instead of being a 5-mile stretch on either side, it's going to expand to 10 miles on either side. Again, in this checkerboard pattern. And so the railroad, by building this line, is going to get access to 20 miles worth of land interspersed with then stuff that the government owns. Okay? The government also encourages railroads to expand through making loans, low-interest loans. The government would loan money to these railroads. Now, here's the thing. We talked earlier about why did the economy expand? Well, it's because the government took a laissez-faire attitude, leave it alone. These two things right here are not laissez-faire. A true laissez-faire means that the government stays out of it. So in this case, what we're talking about is the government is staying out of regulating business. Government policies that promote business, yes, government will do that. Government policies that try to hinder business, no, we must have laissez-faire capitalism. Okay? Now, because railroads are growing, because the government saw them as so important, railroads then had incredible influence over government and over government policy, which is going to be something we'll see in all these other big businesses. Okay? It is the railroads that created time zones. Okay? There is this horrible math problem out there. You might have seen it before. It might have been used as a joke or something. A train leaves New York headed west at 35 miles an hour. Another train leaves Chicago headed east at 50 miles an hour. How long is it before they slam into each other and kill everybody? The problem in the Gilded Age is that's not a math problem. That's a real life problem. Those switch tracks that they had to build on either side, well you threw a switch and it switched the track over, switched the train over to one track so they didn't hit each other, but you had to throw the switch at the right time. Okay? Or if if one train is late and you throw the switch too early, the other one diverts, but fine, but it comes back on the same track too early or something. And so they were, railroads were hitting each other and causing mass chaos. And so the railroads got together and decided that they would adopt time zones so everybody knew exactly what time trains were coming through and leaving stations. And then they went to Congress and said, these are the time zones we have established. We want the country to adopt them and use them. And so that's how we ended up divided into 4 time zones. Not because the government said, but because the railroads said we would use them. Railroads are going to be important because they're going to connect the country. The Transcontinental Railroad, the first Transcontinental Railroad, was completed in 1869. It's going to be the first of several. And once the government saw that these things were important, that they were connecting the country, the government is going to extend more land grants and more opportunities for more railroads to do that and connect the country. So why are these railroads good? Well, obviously they're good thanks to them. They do create thousands of jobs in supporting industries. Those rails are made of steel. They're going to increase the steel business in the United States. People are going to be able to ship more things on the railroads. That's going to create new shipping industries. They would string up telegraph and telephone line next to the railroad tracks. Southern Pacific Railroad. Southern Pacific Railroad set up their own telephone line, their own telephone company. It was called Southern Pacific Railroad International Telephone. Now take the abbreviation for that. SPRINT. Southern Pacific Railroad International Telephone created what we now know as Sprint. Because you can get on a train and you can travel across the country, that expands the settlement of the West. The new railroads are going to encourage more technological innovation. How can we create a more efficient railroad engine? What kinds of rail cars can we put on there? What if we wanted to ship food across country? Well, we need to keep the food cold, so refrigerated rail cars would be created. And most importantly, and I've already said this, they knit the country together, not only with transportation, but also with communication. However, there are negatives to these big businesses. The railroads were seen, and a lot of the big businesses were seen as symbols of corruption. This is a cartoon of Vanderbilt and some of the smaller railroad owners. Notice how they have everything tied up. They're over here controlling railroads, bridges. You had to pay tolls. The railroad company would put a bridge in, and then any other railroad that wanted to use that line had to pay a toll. Well, at one point, Vanderbilt was trying to buy some of the railroads up in the north, and they didn't want to sell out to him, and he said, fine, I own all the bridges into New York City. And he started charging such outrageous tolls that these businesses could not pay them, and so they were not allowed to go across the bridge, which shut down their ability to get into New York City, which gave him then a monopoly on that. Okay. Once you were a monopoly, you were able to charge much higher rates. We'll see this here in just a second. And then they also took advantage of both consumers and the government. We can't forget that they took advantage of the government. Okay, so how did they take advantage of people? Well, one of the ways they took advantage of consumers was through the difference between what are called long-haul rates and short-haul rates. Long haul is going to be over a long distance. Short haul is obviously going to be over a shorter distance. So we'll use as our example, say, New York to Chicago. New York to Chicago would be the long haul. You probably would have, say, 5 railroad companies serving New York and serving Chicago. Each one is going to take a different route to get from New York to Chicago. But in New York and Chicago, they're in competition. And so they would lower rates. Because they are in competition, they're trying to compete for business. However, because each one of those 5 railroads takes a different route to get from New York to Chicago, only one of them might run through the smaller communities between New York and Chicago. So you might end up with, one railroad serving, say, Springfield, Illinois. That railroad line serves the New York to Springfield to Chicago route. New York to Chicago is a very long distance. the railroad is going to stop in Springfield, but what would happen is a lot of times the people in Springfield would end up paying more per mile to ship their goods from Springfield to Chicago, even though it's just up the line. And the railroad would justify it, saying, we are the only railroad you can use. So how do they take advantage of government? Well, several different ways. One example is this thing called the credit mobiler scandal. Credit mobiler scandal might be difficult for you to understand at the beginning, but hang with me through this explanation here. Credit mobiler is a construction company that was created by a railroad called Union Pacific. Okay? So we've got Union Pacific, and they create another company called Credit Mobiler. Credit Mobiler's job was to build and repair railroads. So Union Pacific creates a company that they are then going to contract with to build and repair their railroad lines. Essentially, you have the same owners of both companies. Credit Mobiler then is going to send their bills to Union Pacific, but they're going to overcharge them for the work. Union Pacific, because the bills are so high, because they are inflated, Union Pacific then faces the possibility of bankruptcy. They go to the government, and they use a term that we used again a couple of years ago called we are too big to fail. The country will be in such bad shape if Union Pacific fails. The government is then going to authorize giving money, we might call it a bailout, to Union Pacific so they can pay their bills. Union Pacific is going to pay Credit Mobiler, which is owned by the people who own Union Pacific, and they're just going to pocket that money that the government gave them. Okay? It might be difficult to understand, but think about it. Okay? You create a business, and then you create another business that's going to do work for you. You then overcharge yourself. You smile and look at the government, your parents, or somebody else and say, I need money to pay this other company over here that has overcharged me. Ha ha ha. You then pocket the money they give you because they don't want you to fail. And that's what the Credit Mobiler scandal was. So, done with railroads, let's move over to the oil industry. The oil industry started to pick up in the late 1800s. The first oil well in the United States was drilled by this guy named Edwin Drake in 1859. And over time, the oil industry started to pick up, and really what they were doing is they were producing kerosene. Maybe you've seen kerosene lanterns in your house, or maybe in your grandparents' house, whatever. If you look here at this political cartoon, this guy is John D. Rockefeller. And so maybe you've seen a lantern like this. This is a kerosene lantern. John D. Rockefeller is going to create a company called Standard Oil in 1870. Their original job was they were producing kerosene. Okay? Kerosene is how everybody lit their homes. By 1879, Standard Oil was able to take control of 90% of all U.S. oil refineries. Okay? Not the oil drilling, just the refineries, the ability to turn the oil into kerosene. Okay? The way Rockefeller did this was through something called horizontal integration. We need to know this term, horizontal integration. That is where you purchase companies that are engaged in similar operations to your own. An example today would be Yum Foods Incorporated. Okay? They started out, if I have my dates correct, it started out as a company you might have heard of called KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Kentucky Fried Chicken, the fast food chicken place, they actually bought out Taco Bell. Later they bought out Pizza Hut. Since then they have added Long John Silver's. They have added another company called A&W, which is a hamburger place. Maybe you've heard of, maybe you've looked at Pizza Hut's. Where do they get wings from? They get it from Wing Street. They adopted that brand and just moved it into Pizza Hut. All these companies, they're all fast food companies, but they're all engaged in the same thing, providing food to people. And so horizontal integration, if you can think of it like this, it's going across the street and buying up the competition. When there's no competition, you've got your monopoly. The steel industry. Let's look at the steel industry for just a second. Steel industry is going to be symbolized by Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is actually a Scottish immigrant, but when he gets into the steel business, he will introduce into his steel mill something called the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process was a process that was used to create a higher quality but also cheaper steel. And so you've got better steel, and you're able to charge less for it. So of course people started using that. Carnegie is going to use vertical integration to grow his company. What vertical integration is, another term you need to know, is buying out the companies that are involved in the steps of production. So what Carnegie did is he bought out iron ore mines and coal mines and copper mines and those. He also bought railroads, not large railroads, just railroad lines that would take the iron ore from the mine to the steel mill. And so when you do that, you cut out the middleman and you're able to lower your cost of production there. In 1901, Carnegie sold his business. He was tired of being in business and he was ready to retire. So in 1901, he sold to a guy named J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan bought not only Carnegie Steel but several other steel mills and created U.S. Steel. And eventually, U.S. Steel controlled 60% of U.S. steel manufacturing in the United States. Carnegie sold out for somewhere between $400 and $500 million, which that's in 1901 money. If you want to adjust that for inflation, he's insanely wealthy. Other industries, and I'm going to run through these kind of quickly. Communications. You probably know Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. He and his investors created the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. Maybe you have. Electricity, you've probably heard of this guy, Thomas Edison, who was using, playing around with electricity, and he was using direct current. And of course, he's famous for inventing the light bulb, but he also invented a lot of other things that were associated with electricity. His company was called Edison Electric. He really wasn't that good of a businessman. Propping him up, paying for him to continue his experiments and continue his research was J.P. Morgan, who we'll look at again. Edison was also in competition with a guy named George Westinghouse. Westinghouse hired someone that Edison had fired, a guy named Nikola Tesla, who had developed alternating current, felt that was a more efficient way of producing electricity, and so Westinghouse and Edison were in competition. There's food processing and the transportation of food. Philip Armour, A.J. Hines, and Gail Borden were all people involved in food processing. And then in finance, this guy, J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan, he wasn't just, his family had been in finance, but he wasn't just in finance. He was also about buying up companies and creating these huge things. When he finally got tired of Edison not able to produce kind of the great profits he was looking for, he finally just went out and bought out, used a hostile takeover, bought up enough stock in Edison Electric to take over the company. He also bought out Westinghouse and merged them together to create General Electric, GE. So you got Morgan creating GE, he's created U.S. Steel, and I don't know if you've ever heard of an institution called J.P. Morgan Chase, banking. So he's kind of into everything. So how do we look at all these people? How do we look at these business leaders? There's basically three ways to look at them. One way we could look at them is as captains of industry. Okay? these were people who made huge sums of money. They made tons of profits. Why? Because they were able to dominate and control the industries that they got involved in. They were captains of industry. They advanced our economic interests. Okay? Again, what is good for business is good for America. They provided jobs. Without them, think of all the people that worked for them that wouldn't have those jobs had these guys not created these huge empires. They also encouraged technological advancement. Okay? J.P. Morgan paying Edison to just create things and create things. He was Edison's benefactor. When Edison created the light bulb, imagine you have your house, you don't have light in it. Edison's original concept was outside of your house. You had to have a shed where he had the generator. And then he wired your house. Well, J.P. Morgan had him wire his house and then basically gave parties where he invited all of his rich friends, come over to my house, we're going to have a party tonight. And they'd come over and everything would be lit with candles and kerosene lanterns and whatever. And then J.P. Morgan would say, okay, we're going to do something here. Blow out all the candles. And then he would say, and now Mr. Edison is going to light the house. And Edison would flip a switch, the generator out back would turn on, and all of a sudden the house would light up. And all of J.P. Morgan's friends, oh my goodness, I must have this for my house too. Well then, Edison and Morgan are going to look at it and say, okay, how do we create bigger generators that wouldn't just light up a house, but would light up entire neighborhoods and entire cities? These guys also exemplified something that we call social Darwinism. You should be familiar with Darwin's theories on evolution. One of the principles is survival of the fittest, which actually starts out as an economic principle. The fittest business will survive. But survival of the fittest, in this case, is being applied to society. Why were these people able to succeed where others failed? Something in their nature allowed them to be successful. Rockefeller is a great example of this. Rockefeller's father was pretty useless. He would run off for months at a time. He was, we might call them a street vendor, a hustler, whatever. He would roam around, going to county fairs, trying to, snake oil salesman, selling things that really didn't work. Just picking up enough money to basically support his drinking habit. Rockefeller figured out at the age of like 10 how to make homemade fudge, candy, and would make these bricks of fudge and take it to school and sell it to his classmates. And he was actually starting, not earning enough to make a good living at it, but he was kind of supporting his mother who was left at home while her husband ran around doing who knows what. So Rockefeller came from nothing. Carnegie's an immigrant. Carnegie got a job at the age of 10 working for a railroad company. And because he was working as hard as he could day in, day out, the president of that company, a guy named Tom Scott, saw that and kind of took Carnegie under his wing and started promoting him up through the railroad company. Carnegie saved his money and saved it to a point where he looked at Scott one day and said, look, I'm ready to branch out on my own. And Scott wished him all the luck in the world and actually gave him an opportunity by hiring his company to build one of the first bridges across the Mississippi River. Okay? So these guys, something in their DNA allowed them to take over these industries and become this wealthy. We can also look at them as robber barons. Robber barons, maybe as the name implies, earned their money basically by stealing it. Maybe not necessarily exactly by stealing it, but by taking advantage of the people around them. And these guys made their money by taking advantage of everybody. They exploited their workers, as this cartoon shows right here. Pullman. Pullman is the railroad company, and you see they are paying their employees next to nothing. They're squeezing every last dollar they can out of their employees. Okay? The people that worked for these guys made really pathetically low wages. The hours they worked were very long. We're not talking an 8-hour day. We're talking a 10-hour day, a 12-hour day, maybe a 14-hour day. the jobs were sometimes incredibly dangerous. Probably the best example of how they exploited workers was Andrew Carnegie. He had his employees work something called the swing shift. Carnegie's steel mills operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 2 shifts. One 12-hour shift followed by another 12-hour shift. And you did this Monday through Saturday, 12 on, 12 off, until you got to Sunday. Carnegie believed that his employees needed Sunday off. So on Sundays, one of those shifts is going to also cover the other shift. So you're going to work your 12 hours, but so your fellow workers can have the day off, you're going to work their 12-hour shift also. You're working in a steel mill for 24 hours. You're awake for 24 hours. That's incredibly dangerous. You know something is going to go wrong. But it's okay, because next Sunday, the other shift is going to cover your 12-hour shift, so you'll have that Sunday off to, recover from all that. So, highly exploitive. They also exploit consumers. They take advantage of consumers. If you gained a monopoly, you were able to turn around and immediately raise prices. J.D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, owning 90% of the refinery business. If you pumped oil out of the ground, you had to get it turned into kerosene. You basically have no other place to go except Rockefeller. And so he would buy your oil for whatever he wanted because there's no one else that can buy it. And then he's going to turn around and raise the prices on consumers, because where are you going to get your kerosene from? Well, we don't know. There's no one else, and so they can charge whatever. These businesses, competing businesses, would also get involved in things called pools. Pools are where competing businesses agree to divide up the market. We might look today at, say, the airline industry. We have, say, American, United, Delta, and Southwest. We'll use those as our 4 examples. They might agree to set prices. They're going to pool their resources, and they're going to set prices so they don't have to worry about competition. They don't have to worry about prices going down. They'll agree to set prices very high, and it doesn't matter which airline we go to. We're going to pay the same high price either way. Another way they might do it is with the railroad industry back in the day. They might say, look, our railroad is going to carry passengers, your railroad will carry cargo, and we'll divide the market that way. There's also something that they form called trusts. A trust is where you have a holding company or a parent company, and they own separate businesses, separate firms that look like they're independent, but in reality they're owned by this one giant holding company. Okay? Standard Oil is one of these companies that they own. They own several different things. And people looked at them as just kind of the symbol of corruption. If you look at the Standard Oil octopus here, what all does Standard Oil control? Well, they control banks, they control shipping, they control small oil companies, and look where one of the tentacles even reaches all the way up over here to the Capitol. Okay? Now, because they did engage in these activities, American consumers are going to cry out, or going to complain, and they demand that the government do something to stop these businesses. Okay? And so Congress is going to respond to the demands of the people by passing a couple different laws. The first one is the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. The Interstate Commerce Act outlawed unfair pricing. Oh, and I should note that this was originally directed at the railroads. So it outlawed unfair pricing, the long haul versus short haul thing. That is supposed to be illegal. It declared that railroad rates must be fair and reasonable. You couldn't suddenly raise rates for some crazy reason. It also created something called the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was set up to investigate railroads and publish their findings. The problem with the ICC is if they found you had done one of these things, they didn't really have any power to do anything to you. They didn't have the ability to punish you. This is Congress creating the law. Okay, these are the things that are going to be illegal, and we're going to create this entity over here that isn't going to be able to punish anybody for actually breaking the law. You know, they're going to send you a strongly worded letter. Okay? In 1890, Congress also created something called the Sherman Antitrust Act, made being a trust illegal. Okay? Made being a monopoly illegal. A trust is basically a monopoly. The way Congress worded it is they worded it and they said that it banned all combinations in restraint of trade. All combinations that would prevent free and fair trade. That's an important thing to note. Later on when we look at labor unions, we'll come back to this phrase here. The problem with these two laws at the beginning is they don't do anything. Railroads are going to continue to charge unfair prices. The ICC will point it out and then, wag their finger at them. The Sherman Antitrust Act is going to be interpreted initially by the courts so very narrowly that no actual monopoly is actually really affected by the Sherman Antitrust Act. What is important about these laws is that they were important precedents. They will be used effectively later. It's important to at least get them on the books. Okay? The problem is, this is the situation going on in Congress. Okay? We have all of our trusts. Here's the Standard Oil Trust. Here's the Copper Trust. Here's the Steel Beam Trust. Okay? Here in the Senate, if we look down here, the bosses of the Senate, all of our senators looking back over here, and if you can see how these guys are kind of dressed, look at them. I don't know if you can see what they are. They look kind of like money bags. This is something we'll look at in class on a later date, because I really like this cartoon. Okay. Now, government regulation was at least somewhat successful on the state level. Okay. The states had more effect doing this. The state of Illinois kind of took some of the leadership in this. There's a court case called Munn versus Illinois, where the Supreme Court ruled that government was allowed to regulate businesses if that regulation served the public interest. In this case, it was referring to grain elevators, grain storage facilities that were overcharging farmers. The state of Illinois said you can do that. Everyone had to be charged these same rates. The grain elevator operators sued, and the Supreme Court said, no, the state of Illinois is right because you serve the public interest by providing the storehouses for the food. However, most of the time the courts are still going to side with the businesses. Okay? A later court case also coming out of Illinois, Wabash versus Illinois. The Wabash Railroad Company sues the state of Illinois. Illinois said it was illegal for railroad companies to charge different rates to different people, basically. Wabash Railroad sued, saying, look, we operate in Illinois, but we also operate in Ohio, and we operate in Indiana, and this is called interstate commerce, which the Constitution says only Congress can regulate. And the Supreme Court ruled that Illinois was in violation, said states cannot regulate interstate commerce. Had the Wabash Railroad only operated in Illinois, it would have been fine. That would be intra-state, within one state. Instead, they're operating across state lines. They're in 2 or more states, and that's interstate commerce. Later on, there will be a court case called U.S. versus E.C. Knight. This is against the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court ruled the Sherman Antitrust Act didn't apply to the E.C. Knight Corporation. They refined sugar, and this had to do with the manufacturing process. E.C. Knight argued each one of their manufacturing plants was in a different location, and so since that single manufacturing plant was only in one state, it could not be regulated by the Sherman Antitrust Act because it was only in that one state. You're not going to put a business, say, straddling state borders. If you put it on the state line between Arkansas and Texas, then that manufacturing plant would be interstate commerce. No, you're going to locate it either in Texas or in Arkansas or wherever. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right. The Sherman Antitrust Act doesn't apply to manufacturing. And so, it limited the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now there's a third way to look at these guys. And I want to point this out because there are different sides to what these guys are. Okay? You can also look at them as philanthropists. Okay? They were rich. They made money. How did they make that money? Was it always fair? Was it always right? No. But what did they do with their money? A lot of them donated their money to charity and tried to get rid of it. Okay? There was this thing called the gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth says that God has blessed the wealthy. God favors these people. Why were they able to make millions? Because God blessed them. God wanted them to have this. Now, within that belief, there's also kind of this inherent idea that, well, why are other people poor? Well, because God doesn't want them to have money. That's kind of a backhanded way. Nobody ever really says that. But that is kind of, an implied bias. What you're not going to see in a lot of books, what you're not going to see and hear from a lot of history teachers, is the other half of what the gospel of wealth is. Okay? This is only half of it. God has blessed the rich. Why has he blessed the rich? Because he expects them to use their wealth to take care of others, to take care of the poor. Okay? That's the thing you're not going to hear. Carnegie was a big believer in this idea of the gospel of wealth. Carnegie has a famous quotation: "He who dies rich dies ashamed." You see, he's going to sell out to J.P. Morgan for, $400 million or whatever, and he's going to spend the rest of his life giving it all away. By the time Carnegie died, he gave away everything but about $50 million, and in his will, the $50 million was dispersed after he died. So technically, he gave away all of it. Okay? What did they give away their money to? They gave away their money to plenty of universities. There's a university out there called Carnegie Mellon, named for Andrew Carnegie and Andrew Mellon. Vanderbilt University. Okay. J.D. Rockefeller donated a ton of money to a small school called Johns Hopkins, specifically to train doctors. Okay. Maybe you've heard of Leland Stanford and his university. It's not Leland Stanford University. It's actually Leland Stanford Jr. University. He named it in honor of his son who had died. But these guys donated all this money to these universities. They created foundations. Okay, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation. They're still around providing stuff. They built libraries. Okay, you can see here this photograph here, the Carnegie Library in Paxton, Illinois. Carnegie believed that everybody needed access to libraries, and actually part of the foundation, you could write to the foundation and say, look, our little town wants to establish a library, and he would send you a check that would cover the building, the books, and the staff for as you got it set up. And so how else do you repay him but by naming your library after him? You can find these libraries, these Carnegie libraries, all across America. You have to find the original building. The original building might not be in use anymore, but somewhere on there, it will say Carnegie Library. And then they also use their things to build and create other things, like Centers for the Performing Arts. Maybe you've heard of something in New York called Carnegie Hall, where the symphonies perform. Okay, so they use their money to benefit others. I apologize for the length of these notes. I know it was long, but hopefully you have a good sense of how those big businesses were created and what they did, and the good, the bad, and maybe the ugly that they were involved in also.